Okay, so this next story is probably going to seem a little petty and self serving, but I couldn't resist. The irony was too delicious. So, if you're a regular listener, you've probably heard me good naturedly complain about the time atheism is unstoppable. A fairly popular atheist YouTuber who I think I'm relatively friendly with, I think, once told me I had a regressive beta male stance on race because briefly in passing I dared to mention things like slavery and Jim Crow when talking about the disproportionately high rate of crime and poverty among African Americans. And I realize the irony in the fact that for someone who claims they're not interested in talking about race, I sure seem to bring it up a lot. But once again, I couldn't refuse this story. So, to put things into context, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, or well, about a year ago on YouTube, I made a video in which I defended AIU's criticisms of Cenk Uygur concerning Cenk's intellectually dishonest coverage of the Dylan Roof case. Now, I think Dylan Roof is a monstrous piece of crap, and I'm outraged and sickened by what he did. He was the deranged white supremacist kid with the Mo Howard bowl cut who murdered all those people in a southern church. So, as much as I despise Dylan Roof, I still value intellectual honesty and fact based reasoning. And I thought Cenk had let his emotions cloud the facts regarding the actions of the judge in the case. And it wasn't just me. Cenk's good friend and co host Ben Mankiewicz also disagreed with Cenk on the topic, during the live stream, no less, which made for interesting viewing. So I agreed with AIU, all was right with the world. That is until one of his subs took issue with my view that we're all so closely related genetically that it may not even make scientific sense to try to separate us into different racial groups. So you're probably sick of hearing this story, but the sub or subscriber in question said you may not believe in race, but you better know what neighborhood you're in, or something like that. And I quickly agreed, true story, that yeah, even if you're agnostic on the question of whether or not race is a scientifically valid concept, it's still a very real concept sociologically speaking, with serious sociological implications and repercussions. And yeah, people are tribal. We divide ourselves among ethnic, ideological, and quote unquote racial lines. So even though we're all Homo sapiens, if a pasty white guy like myself, I'm the world's palest Italian, me and Leonardo DiCaprio, if I find myself in the quote unquote wrong neighborhood at night, things might not turn out so well. But I continued that I didn't think that African Americans are disproportionately mired in poverty and violent crime because they're somehow inferior, and that it, at least in part, is probably to do with historical and sociological factors. Yes, it's true black people in America today aren't being whipped and forced to pick cotton, but I think there is this kind of sociological domino or cause and effect phenomenon where people have to struggle to overcome or shrug off the inherited baggage of their environment. So you have a group of people that start out as slaves. Even after they're granted their freedom, they're still looked at as second class citizens or as the other, segregation, Jim Crow, etc., marginalized into impoverished ghettos. I don't think we're supposed to say ghettos anymore, but hey, despite how I may sound right now, I'm not really one for political correctness. So marginalized into impoverished ghettos, etc., successive generations born into these same impoverished, crime ridden environments. And as I said, this isn't an excuse for violent crime or to not try, as hard as it may be, to lift yourself up out of your negative environment or to overcome a negative upbringing. But I think, as cliche as it sounds, to understand the present, it helps if you have an understanding of the past. In a way, it reminds me of Native Americans. No one's hunting indigenous people and selling their scalps anymore, at least I hope not. But we can still see the effects of the past on Native Americans in the present, living on reservations, still bearing European Christian names, poverty, alcoholism, etc., etc. Or using myself as an example, I come from predominantly Italian and Irish working class stock, and the apples kind of landed pretty close to that tree. Once again, yeah, I don't think you should use the limits of your background or upbringing as an excuse, and you should do your best to make something of yourself. But there are some real sociological phenomena and pulls and pressures at work, I think. But anyway, back to my petty attempt at vindication. So, Atheist Roo and I are both admirers of Sam Harris, and I actually want to stop to blame Sam Harris for the genesis of this episode. I was listening to Sam's Waking Up podcast, as I am wont to do, and the most recent episode was about race, and Sam's guest was Professor Glenn Lowry. And man, oh man, the delicious irony. Sam goes on this whole preamble before the discussion really begins, where he invokes the quote unquote shadow of slavery and Jim Crow, and perhaps somewhat jokingly, to give him the benefit of the doubt, even mentions checking his privilege, something that I've never even said. Oh, Sammy, Samwise, at 2. And then, ironically, I'm using ironic a lot tonight. I dub it the drinking game word of the week. Glenn actually pushes back against Sam's politically correct preamble. But enough procrastinating. Here it is.
And obviously your background, both in mathematics and statistics and social science, makes you really perfectly well placed to have the kind of conversation we're going to have. I've been wanting to talk about race and racism for a while because it's a topic of just such huge consequence. And it's a topic that, again, attracts a fair amount of logical and moral confusion, which renders people unable to reason with each other. And this is not a problem just across racial lines, and it's not just a problem in public. I mean, frankly, I have white friends who I find I can't have this conversation with because they've become so emotionally hijacked. And they don't realize, from my point of view, they don't realize that almost everything that is coming out of their mouths doesn't make moral or logical or historical or psychological sense. And this really worries me because I view the maintenance of civilization and our moral progress as a species really as a sequence of successful conversations. I've said this many times before on my podcast and in writing. It seems to me that we live in perpetual choice between conversation and violence, just as a species. So when I see conversations reliably fail like this, I start to get worried. And so I've been wanting to talk about race, and this is just the context of how I set up this conversation. I noticed the conversations you have been having with John McWhorter, and I realized that I had met John at a TED conference. So I got in touch with him, and then he suggested I speak with you. And so you are my Virgil, who's going to guide me through this wilderness of error. And again, thank you for agreeing to do this.
Hope I'm up to the task here. It's a tall order, actually.
And I guess a final preliminary point, I feel the need to offer a disclaimer up front because
Here we go.
I think you and I are going to agree about many things. And I'm a little worried about this because my staking out some of these positions as a white guy is going to rub many of our listeners the wrong way. And I really don't want to be in a defensive crouch as we have this conversation. So I think I should just acknowledge up front a couple of things that should be obvious, and it should be obvious that I would acknowledge them. And the first is just that the history of racism in the U.S. has obviously been horrific, right? It seems to me no sane person could doubt that. And there's no doubt that racism remains a problem in our society, and just how big a problem is something that I want us to discuss. But I can check my privilege at the outset here. I have no doubt that I have reaped many advantages from being white. And I have no idea what it's like to grow up as a black man in our society. So I get that I don't get it. And if there's any way in which my not getting it seems relevant to the issues we're about to touch, I certainly hope you'll point that out to me. But as we drive toward points that many of our listeners will find fairly incendiary, especially coming from a white guy, I just have to make it clear that it is obvious how horrible white racism and its consequences have been in the past. And I am fully prepared to believe that the shadow of slavery and Jim Crow still hangs over our society to a degree that I don't understand in any way, certainly not from my first-person experience. But my goal in this conversation is to get an accurate picture of race and racism and police violence as it occurs now so that we can think about how to move forward. So I just wanted to erect that bulwark, however ineffectual it will prove to be, because I just have no doubt that we're about to say some things that will lend itself to selective quotation and I've now learned through, rather cruel experience that some people listen to this podcast just for the pleasure of quoting me out of context in misleading ways. So, but that's with this caveat, which may do me no good whatsoever. I want to throw that up before we dive into the details.
Well, I was just going to comment that I think your caveat is well taken as far as it goes, and that speaks well of you, I would say. But it's such a pity that it's necessary for you to make that kind of elaborate, preemptive move here. That it bespeaks how closed and tortured is the environment in which we're having the conversation. I'm Black, all right? I am, if anybody is, grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s and the 1960s from a working class background. Have had many a run-in with American racism, all across the board, and descend from people who had been slaves in the United States. On the other hand, we sit here in the year 2016. 1863 is a century and a half in the past. Jim Crow segregation is a distant memory. Barack Hussein Obama is about to step down, having served 2 terms, winning comfortable national elections to the highest office in the land. The commissioners of the police in many of the cities in which Black community relations are most troubled are themselves African American, as often are the administrative officers running the governments of those cities. We are 50 years past the onset of affirmative action. This is not 1910, 1950, or 1985. This is the year 2016. And the idea that white privilege is such a stain on the country that an otherwise rational and intelligent person who happens to be white needs to give an elaborate preamble before they enter the conversation about race relations in this country, that the benefit of the doubt or the willingness to hear something that one doesn't agree with without imputing invidious motives to the person who's expressed that view is so rampant that a person like yourself needs to, in effect, apologize in advance for having an opinion. Come on, that's awful. That's poisonous. That's good. So that's just Glenn Lowry spouting off, and I don't know how that'll leave me in the minds of some of your viewers who might want to take what I've said out of context as well, but that's where I'm coming from here.
Oh, Sam, you regressive beta cuck. Checking your privilege, talking about slavery and Jim Crow. I'm just having a bit of fun, but that was an interesting exchange. And I bet you there's probably a lot of Sam Harris fans out there, kind of, the anti-PC type, that might find themselves actually siding with Glenn Lowry as opposed to Sam regarding that exchange.